The United States and the Soviet Union between them spent trillions of dollars on armaments. The United States, borrowing heavily, could afford it. The Soviet Union, in the end, could not. Gorbachev had done as much as anyone to end the Cold War. He called Bush and told him this was his last day in office. That night, the red flag of the Soviet Union was lowered for the last time. The communist dream of a better society that would outlast the West came to nothing. In Moscow, the daily lines for food grew longer. Tempers rose. The Soviet Communist Party was losing control. Goods in the shops were scarce. Making the transition to a market economy was hard, but they did allow the opening of Moscow's first McDonald's. The young wanted pop music, fashion, the chance to make money, the right to travel.
Society moved on, and the party stayed where it was. People started running like rats from a sinking ship.
Gorbachev gave Soviet citizens for the first time the freedom to demonstrate. Now demonstrations called for an end to the Communist Party's monopoly of power. But communist hardliners opposed reform. Despite them, Gorbachev, himself a communist, chose pluralism. The Communist Party, which had ruled since the October Revolution of 1917, would have to share power with others. It was a complete break with the practice of Lenin and Stalin. Of the 15 republics of the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation was the largest. Most were responding to Gorbachev's loosening control with demands for national freedom. In the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, annexed by Stalin in 1940, the demand was total independence. The other Baltic states, Estonia and Latvia, followed Lithuania's lead and also demanded independence. Vilnius, Lithuania. On the 11th and 12th of January 1991, crack Soviet troops entered the capital to take back public buildings for the Soviet state. Lithuanians flocked to defend their parliament and the radio and television stations. In the early hours of January the 13th, Soviet tanks attacked. If Lithuania were allowed to break free, there would be nothing to stop the other republics doing the same. In Moscow, thousands marched to protest against the crackdown. Boris Yeltsin had been Communist Party chief in Moscow. Popular, ambitious, he now used economic discontent to weaken Gorbachev and the Soviet Union. On the international scene, Gorbachev was still the man the West could do business with. At their meetings, Gorbachev asked Bush for help in his economic difficulties. Bush warned Gorbachev not to use violence if the Baltic states pushed for independence. The Red Army was pulling out of an Eastern Europe it had dominated for decades. In Germany, the troops would leave a question mark behind them. Divided by the Cold War, Germany was moving towards unification. Would the Soviet Union really allow a united Germany to belong to the West's military alliance, NATO?
They really ended up not having any other alternative. If they really meant what they said about we will not use force to keep the empire together, that meant that a country should be free to choose its own alliances.
The West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl undertook to limit Germany's military strength, to pay the Red Army's resettlement costs, not to station nuclear weapons in East Germany. Kohl was ecstatic. Gorbachev had accepted that a united Germany could belong to NATO. The divided Germany, at the heart of the Cold War, was reunited.
Can you imagine we'd live to see the day when we needed coupons to buy socks? There weren't even any socks available. There was nothing on the shelves except out-of-date tins of fish.
Russia, where Yeltsin and his radical Democrats were taking over, had practically declared independence from the Soviet Union.
In summer, Gorbachev went to London. As usual, he basked in the welcome he received overseas. But for the Soviet economy, the urgent need was for financial aid. Gorbachev asked the leading capitalist countries for massive loans. Gorbachev had drafted a new Union treaty, loosening the ties between the Soviet center and the republics. When it was due for signature in August, hardline communists were appalled. On August the 19th, Moscow awoke to the sound of tanks and the news that Gorbachev was ill. An emergency committee had taken over. In Moscow, confused and concerned, people began to gather at the Russian Parliament building, the White House. No one knew where or how Gorbachev was, or what was really happening. Boris Yeltsin, Gorbachev's enemy and rival, defended him and the Constitution.
Давайте будем держаться твердо. Не пройдет реакция. Реакция не пройдет.
Soldiers were refusing to obey the emergency committee. Some commanders turned their tanks around.
We were not bloodthirsty. We were not ready to pay any price to hold on to power.
Yeltsin sent a plane to bring Gorbachev back to Moscow. Far more was changed than Gorbachev realized. Yeltsin was the victor and was now in command.
Сегодня принято решение объявить государственным флагом России трехцветный флаг. Главное, на что ушло, наверное, половина времени, каким быть союзом.
At Minsk, on December the 8th, Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, the three Slav states, acted to dissolve the Soviet Union. The Cold War was a clash of ideologies. and the big Cold War loser was Marxism-Leninism. The communist dream of a better society that would outlast the West came to nothing.
Communism as a system went against life, against man's fundamental needs, against the need for freedom, the need to be enterprising, to associate freely, against the will of the nation. It suppressed national identity. Something that goes against life may last a long time, but sooner or later it will collapse.
The superpowers had confronted each other relentlessly. Now, under intolerable pressure, one side withdrew. Gorbachev had done as much as anyone to end the Cold War. He called Bush and told him this was his last day in office. That night, the red flag of the Soviet Union was lowered for the last time. In Washington, Bush made his Christmas broadcast.
For over 40 years, the United States led the West in the struggle against communism and the threat it posed to our most precious values. This struggle shaped the lives of all Americans. It forced all nations to live under the specter of nuclear destruction. That confrontation is now over.